This person was known not only for his ambitions, but also for his love of fashion trends, one of which ultimately caused his death. Napoleon wasn't the only historical figure affected by deadly trends, but the extent of this issue will surprise you. Throughout history, people have been enamored with bright colors in clothing. Extracting such colors from nature wasn't easy, so the brightest, rarest, and most glowing colors were created by chemists who usually had no idea about the other properties of the substances they invented besides their color. Meet Sheila's green. This dye caused quite a stir in Europe. It's even linked to the mysterious death of Napoleon. In the late 18th century, German chemist Carl Scheele invented a stunning emerald green dye, essentially a lethal mix of arsenic, potassium, and copper. He knew the dye was poisonous, but he was the first to achieve such a vivid green color. It quickly became a hit across Europe, especially in Great Britain. Every fashionista wanted green clothing. Ladies sewed green dresses, hung green curtains, and decorated their walls with green wallpaper. However, these ladies soon started finding ulcers on their bodies after attending balls in green dresses. Residents of green rooms complained of constant nausea and vomiting. Chronic arsenic poisoning led to respiratory problems, various internal diseases, and cancers. The public was finally alarmed by the horrific death of a British flower maker who used Sheila's green dye. The girl fell ill with severe nausea, her eyes turned completely green, and she complained that the whole world was bathed in emerald green. It sounds like a horror story, but it was true. The beautiful green color was based on arsenic. People of that time already knew not to ingest it. Arsenic was deadly poisonous. But the idea that one should not touch or even be near surfaces painted with it was apparently not as clear.
Well, the dye turned out to be extremely toxic, but we have so much of it.
Then let's order the entire bathroom painted with it, along with a few of my dresses.
In his later years, Napoleon loved taking long baths, and the walls in his bathroom were painted with the fashionable Sheila's green. Arsenic was present in his lotion and clothing. Serious studies have been conducted on his death, and although there's a theory of deliberate arsenic poisoning, his symptoms began 5 years before his death, so his love for green certainly contributed to the emperor's demise. We will return to the topic of dyes later, but for now, let's move to Great Britain. Forget about the intricate hedges and meticulously trimmed lawns of 18th century Britain. Your estate wouldn't even be worth mentioning if it didn't have a decorative hermit. Seriously, just like nerds leveling up their gaming skills in their parents' basement, these reclusive oddballs were boosting their spiritual energy in the gardens of aristocrats, meditating and contemplating the meaning of life. And naturally, British aristocrats decided they would make perfect garden gnomes.
Greetings, travelers. What a wonderful morning, isn't it? Perfect for spiritual development.
Look, William, wouldn't it be marvelous if he lived in our garden?
Typically, the wealthy would build a simple stone structure and house an obscure fellow to live there, occasionally decorating it with tree roots, shells, and flowers. This was essentially the equivalent of a homeless junkie from your dumpster living on your property in exchange for food. Hermits were expected to spend their days in isolation, without washing, trimming their hair, or doing anything other than entertaining guests, who could approach the hermit to gain some wisdom.
Do not underestimate Bitcoin. Invest in it as much as you can, and if anyone ever offers you pizza for 1,000 Bitcoins, tell them to get lost. And more importantly, subscribe to this YouTube channel.
What? I don't understand him.
By the 19th century, this fad had fallen out of fashion. I'm letting you know this so you abandon the idea of picking up a homeless person from downtown for your backyard in exchange for candy. Or what they're up to. Glowing cosmetics. In the pre-nuclear history of humanity, radioactive isotopes had already been discovered and actively researched, yet their effects on the human body were unknown. This lack of knowledge didn't stop dozens of companies from vigorously developing the industry of bright and glowing paints and cosmetics. In 1908, a magical glowing green paint hit the market. This paint contained radium, which caused it to glow beautifully. It was primarily used in factories that made clocks and alarm clocks. The paint was applied to the hands so they could be seen in the dark and would glow, according to the company, for decades. This delicate work was done by radium girls. Young workers were thrilled with their new jobs and access to such technologies. They even often painted designs on each other's faces and colored their lips with the glowing paint before going to dances or parties. It probably looked very fashionable and youthful. Everything was great until the 1920s, when these girls suddenly began to fall ill en masse. They developed ulcers around their mouths, their jaws literally rotted, and they formed huge, terrifying tumors. The radiation accumulated in their bodies, especially around their mouths, because many licked their brushes while working and also used the ill-fated paint on their lips. Several girls died. In 1928, they filed a collective lawsuit against their employers for causing harm to their health and won. After this, glowing paint was banned in factories. For the maimed girls, this was scant consolation. Did the era of radioactive paints end there? Pfft. In 1936, the American company Fiestaware released a very beautiful line of bright orange ceramics. The dishes soon became a real hit. Sales grew every year until 1959, when the company suddenly shut down production due to scandals related to lethal outcomes. In the 1930s, there was another way to use isotopes: radioactive cosmetics. Humanity was crazy about radiation, considering it a universal remedy for everything. Thorium chloride and radium bromide were supposed to supply cells with vital energy, enhance blood circulation, blah blah blah. But instead, fashionistas aged quickly. The tissues in the areas of application became flabby, and the women themselves died from incurable cancers. However, with all its consequences, radiation was not the most frightening thing that could harm the health of a fashionable woman. How did the battle for that slender waist go in the 19th century? Have you seen what waists were in fashion back then? The standard of those years was a 16-inch waist. So, to eat and lose weight, women took a new miracle remedy: tablets. But the tablets contained tapeworm eggs, and the poor women infected their bodies with enormous tapeworms. The parasite grew inside the host, consuming part of the eaten food. The more they ate, the bigger the worms grew, up to 60 yards long. The tapeworm could travel through the body, consuming the liver, kidneys, and even the brain. The horror of the scandal was when the contents of the miracle tablets were discovered, and the same worms were found in the bodies of the sick. Imagine what it must have been like for ladies to realize that a living worm was crawling inside their bodies, one they had unknowingly introduced into themselves. And getting rid of it was impossible at that moment. They just had to accept that and carry it in their stomachs like a fetus. Tuberculosis. At the end of the 19th century, Europe was experiencing a tuberculosis epidemic. In France, 1 in 6 people died from it, while in England, it was 1 in 4. The symptoms of tuberculosis, cough, weight loss, and pallor, were somehow considered fashionable. Women admired pale skin, feverish blush, and thinness. Dying from tuberculosis was seen as terribly prestigious, so many perfectly healthy people pretended to have it. The most popular means for achieving pallor was the same lead mixed with vinegar, used to make white makeup, giving that romantic pallor that was at the height of popularity. Lead had been known since antiquity. No other white paint was as convenient and bright. When lead white began to be used for interior decoration, construction crews started complaining of headaches, and many developed liver problems. It turned out that inhaling finely dispersed paint and licking brushes coated with Swedish lead white had irreversible consequences. And that's not even mentioning its cosmetic use. Lead accumulates in the body, actively destroys the liver, and damages the brain while being nearly impossible to remove from the body. However, this was only realized in the 20th century. Lead caused aggression, headaches, vomiting, convulsions, and ultimately, death. When the deadly danger of lead went out of fashion, a new miracle remedy emerged in the 19th century: arsenic. And it worked. Arsenic indeed made the skin pale, but its side effect was death. At that time, a product called harmless arsenic wafers for improving complexion was widely advertised. People would apply arsenic lotions to their faces and ingest arsenic, believing it improved the blood. Naturally, arsenic had to be taken in small amounts, gradually increasing the dose until it led to a fatal outcome. Chinese foot fetish. If you want to take fashion to the extreme, look no further than the Chinese. They are unparalleled masters in this domain. For nearly a millennium, China had a craze for the golden lotus foot. What was it? Chinese mothers would bind their daughters' feet, starting at the age of 4, to reduce the foot size as much as possible. The ideal foot length was considered to be no more than 3 inches. To achieve this, the toes were pressed against the sole and tightly wrapped with bandages. Special shoes were made, and the girls were forced to walk in them. Up until the age of 8, the child's shoe size was continually reduced until the foot became 3 or 4 inches in length. Naturally, this procedure grotesquely deformed the feet and caused unbearable pain, but no one cared. Girls with bound feet were made to walk several miles a day. These poor souls wore their feet to the bone. The bent toes would eventually die off, turning into dry, flat stubs embedded into the sole with almost perpetual abscesses. However, in special shoes, the feet resembled a curved young moon. This was precisely what the caring mothers were striving to achieve with admiration and intrigue. Wealthy Chinese women tried so hard to excel in this endeavor that they could barely walk on their own and had to be carried around in carts. Men, by the way, would boast to each other about whose wife had the smallest foot, but they never actually saw their wives' and concubines' bare feet. Such a sight would disgust them. Heaven forbid, only in shoes. Men knew about the women's agony, but didn't want to spoil their psyche by seeing something ugly. They preferred to just enjoy the results. Even at night, wives slept in special night shoes, never giving their feet any respite. Such inequality and discrimination were driven by Confucian ideology. As in many ancient cultures, women had virtually no rights. Following the fashion, men admired the small crescent-shaped foot. The first thing a groom's parents would ask when looking for a bride for their son was the size of her foot, the main virtue of a girl in those days. When the Manchus conquered China in the 17th century and established their dynasty, one of the first decrees by the Manchu emperor was to ban foot binding. But it was in vain. Even then, the Chinese ignored this decree and continued to bind their daughters' feet. Personally, I find such feet absolutely unattractive, especially considering the suffering this fashion caused women. Out of curiosity, I asked my Chinese friend if she found these shoes attractive. To my surprise, she indeed saw something interesting in them. So, the ideal of female beauty in China: small feet, long thin fingers, soft hands, delicate white skin, a high forehead, small ears, thin eyebrows, small rounded lips, and, of course, grotesquely tiny feet. It's not for me to judge, as someone truly saw this vampiric image as the epitome of beauty. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see a full video on all the oddities of China. You have no idea what else they did. Tooth decay. In the Middle Ages, tooth decay was genuinely trendy for a while. The main cause of tooth decay was believed to be worms, and dental treatments were virtually non-existent. However, this didn't deter people at all, as they knew that tooth decay was only prevalent among the wealthy, since only they could afford sugar. For instance, Queen Elizabeth I of England suffered from such poor dental health that she had to have almost all her teeth removed. She would wear pieces of cloth in her mouth to prevent her cheeks from sinking in. During this time, a fashion for bad teeth emerged. In their desire to emulate the nobility, common folk would rub their teeth with charcoal. Naturally, this did nothing good and only scratched the enamel of their healthy teeth. Aristocrats who were unlucky enough to have healthy teeth did the same. If you enjoyed this video, check out our video on strange and insane fashion trends.